Hello, welcome to this special conversation that I'm having with Asmerom. This is the second part in a series of talks that I'm having to understand the war in Tigray from the perspectives of an Eritrean and a Tigrayan living in the United States. I'm pleased to have Asmerom back on the Eritrean Studies Forum as someone who has reached out to me to discuss a wide variety of issues pertaining to the conflict in Ethiopia. Asmaram, to begin, I just want to ask, given the recent developments of airstrikes that have occurred in Tigray, what do you think needs to happen in order for the international community to understand the seriousness of what has happened, in particular the civilian casualties, and also what would you say has been the overall loss that has occurred? Have you experienced any personal losses yourself, or are you willing to speak about those issues?
Thanks, George. As far as the airstrikes and the drone attacks are concerned, I mean, this is just part and parcel of the mixed signals that Addis Ababa is sending. I think they have drone technology that they've received from Iran and the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, and they're intending on using civilians and civilian infrastructure as guinea pigs in Tigray to test these weapons out to see how effective they are. Maybe, uh, maybe as a ploy to further terrorize the population. As Tigray is under siege, you know, the most of Tigray region is still under the government of Tigray, but I think it serves as a sort of psychological weapon that although the forces may not be in the region in any significant number, the threat is still there, and we're still a force to be reckoned with. And I think due to the communications blackout, the question you asked me is, how, do I have my family been affected? A lot of the times, I don't know. I have not been able to speak to my relatives, like many of them, for months. So I think the not knowing is almost as bad as just knowing that something's happened to them. And that's the point of the conflict that we have reached. As far as the international community is concerned, I mean, this is something that can only be resolved diplomatically. If the African Union decides to come out one day and says, we have to have a ceasefire, no, including ceasefire from drones and airstrikes, and that's something that I think could happen. But I think the ball is in the court of the Ethiopian government. Uh, so quite frankly, I don't see how the issue of airstrikes and the war more generally can be resolved without more stringent diplomatic measures and more diplomatic unity. Let's say, for example, the new U.S. envoy and the new Chinese envoy to the Horn of Africa are actually uh, able to agree on something, maybe agree to ceasefire. And I think those two voices can be really strong in determining where this war goes and where it potentially ends.
Well, one of the reasons why I ask this question is because it has uh, the drone strikes, which have occurred over the course of the past couple of weeks, more recently at the time of this recording, have had such a devastating impact on Tigray, on the civilian population, on the refugee population as well, the Eritrean refugees who were killed in airstrikes as a result of increased drone usage by the Ethiopian Air Force. To what extent would you express the urgency of the situation to the international community if you had the chance to speak with people at the highest levels of government throughout the world? We've seen in other examples in conflict that drone usage against supposed military targets have ended up with mass casualties and infrastructure damage to the extent that it's almost irreversible, and the devastation that it brings to a population is uh, untenable. How would you express this to others, and what do you think the people of Tigray need the international community to know?
I think what we need to do is let these actors that are involved in this conflict understand that the continuation of this conflict is actually detrimental to their own interests, right? The last time I was in Ethiopia, which was 2014, I noticed a lot of Turkish schools, not only in Addis Ababa, but also in Magala as well. Is a completely destroyed and fractured Ethiopia good for Turkish investments? Is it good for Chinese investments? I mean, they've invested heavily in the country for years, especially during the era of the EPRDF. Um, the United Arab Emirates, they've haven't made their financial presence known yet, but they're definitely looking for countries in the eastern part of Africa to provide it with agricultural products. A part of the dispute of the Al Fashaga land that exists in Sudan is linked to the fertility of the land, the ability of the land to produce um, uh, good output that can help with these Gulf countries. So they need to understand, is a fractured Ethiopia good for their interests as well? So, the international community might display concern for civilian deaths and for civilian tragedy, but ultimately they're swayed by their interests, and that's what guides them in international politics. Um, I think the international community should also realize that the health situation in Tigray is just worsening every single day. I mean, I just saw a video of doctors in either hospital having to wash gloves with water and soap for them to use it in surgeries and childbirth. So they can't even get sterile gloves. Um, so I think as the situation in Tigray continues to deteriorate, the people are less willing and less willing to even remain in the country. And that contributes again to the fracture of the country, the stability of the country. If you have an entire group of people who don't want to be in the entity, I mean, look at the issue that we have in Nigeria, in Biafra, right? Very similar parallels between between Biafra and Tigray. And unless these issues are settled diplomatically, and unless these issues are actually dealt with instead of delayed, you're always going to have this cycle of instability and this cycle of the lack of cohesiveness that the country is currently engaged in. And again, it goes back to their interest. Is a united Ethiopia the interest of all of these international actors? And I think it is. And they need to realize that as the situation gets worse, that becomes more and more compromised. As far as the refugees, I mean, as you know, there's well over 100,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigrayan refugee camps. I kind of wanted to ask you, George, if you may know any of relatives or family friends that have happened to pass through to Tigray, whether during the conflict or before the conflict, and if you have any insights on the refugee crisis there and how have they been able to cope during the war. Because I think Eritrean refugees are one of the only group of people in the conflict that have actually suffered from both sides, right? Tigrayan militias have harassed and killed and committed atrocities against Eritrean refugees. Same in the same light as Eritrean forces who were in the region for many months. So if you have any insight on that, I'd definitely like to hear it. And also, what's the sense moving forward? I know that there is a campaign to try to get them to be relocated. Where is that at?
Certainly, I think the situation with Eritrean refugees in Tigray is precarious, to say the least. For the past 14 months now, the Eritrean refugees that were already in Tigray faced increasing scrutiny from the Eritrean government to return by way of the Eritrean Defense Forces coaxing them or convincing them that they were more safe uh, in Eritrea. Unfortunately, it was a uh, premature decision on the part of the Eritrean government, and it's been a very sobering experience for them. Eritrean refugees have been massacred across the camps in Tigray by both sides of the conflict. They've been forcibly repatriated back to Eritrea in some instances, and particularly the youth have had to join the military again. Um, Earlier last year, when the COVID-19 situation in Eritrea was situated, there was actually an attempt to reopen schools in order to draft the next round of 11th graders back into the Sawa military camp that eventually is training the Eritrean soldiers. And more recently, they're trying to recruit more Eritreans. Human Rights Watch actually released their world report, and they cited that Eritrean youth were being rounded up in large numbers in order to account for the losses sustained by the Eritrean military over the past year. And this all feeds back into the system of why they had to flee in the first place, which is the indefinite national military service as a result of the government's policy that the country is on a permanent war footing, that the population needs to inherit the generational struggle of independence. And in order to achieve that, being in a militaristic setting is the only way that they can understand that the sacrifices made by their forefathers was worth it. And I think they've really honestly bastardized the legacy of Eritrea, the Eritrean government I'm talking about. They've really manipulated the legacy of Eritreans who fought for our independence and have used it in such a way to justify some of the most horrific things that you could read. As I'm sure you know, the UN Commission of Inquiry released a special one-year investigation report on the extent to which the Eritrean government represses its own people. In the context of this current conflict in Tigray, fortunately, I have not had any family members who've been directly affected by the refugee outflow. But I will say that I do know people personally who have lost some family members or have had to worry about whether or not they've been able to be resettled to a different country. In one particular instance, I know someone who, fortunately enough, had a family member relocated back in Rwanda, which is a very rare instance, I would say, in the case of the conflict in Tigray, where it's almost impossible to get out of the war zone. The only reason that was even possible was because of the extent to which reporting in the region has allowed the international community to act. And through the use of the UNHCR's evacuation process, when Eritrean refugees in Addis Ababa were protesting for their relocation or their resettlement to a different country, they were able to actually get get Eritrean refugees and other displaced peoples to go to a different country. In Addis Ababa as well, it's not just Eritreans, also Tigrayans who speak Tigrinya have been rounded up en masse and have been locked away in detention centers. This has occurred, and I'm not sure if it's stopped, but it certainly has occurred to a large extent to many Eritreans and Tigrayan civilians who speak Tigrinya in the capital city and in the municipalities of Addis Ababa. And that's also been a way that Eritreans have been affected in this conflict, is that they cannot distinguish between the two. So as a result, they just they take everyone, and then the Eritrean government asks the Ethiopian government to deport them back to Eritrea if possible. The extent to which this has happened is unclear because there's no independent reporting that has been able to track all of the cases of deportation back to Eritrea. It's, as you said, the telecommunications blackout has um, been a way to veil the crimes of the Ethiopian government, essentially to mask the extent to which all of these instances of crimes against humanity, I would say, have occurred. When you send a refugee back to their country of origin as a host nation, you are endangering their life. And I don't understand how, Ethiopia used to be a very generous refugee granting country. And in the time since Abiy Ahmed became the prime minister, they've been very reluctant to give refugee status, especially to Eritreans. After Isaias and Abiy made their partnership public, um, since the signing of the so-called peace and friendship agreement, prima facie status, which was a given to Eritrean refugees up until 2020, was something that every Eritrean who was in Tigray, in particular, hoped to get, as long as they were able to present themselves as a refugee, as an asylum seeker first. Well, since then, now every Eritrean refugee in Tigray is at risk of being killed, being deported back to Eritrea, or being repatriated by the military. And so it's really it's an unreported crime, underreported crime, I would say. It does make the news on occasion, but the extent to which we actually know how many people have gone through this, we just don't know. It's clouded, as I said, in mystery. And it all goes back to the opaqueness of the system of Eritrea, which they don't ever acknowledge that they're refugees. In fact, the information minister, Yamane Gebre Meskel, used refugees in quotations whenever he cites the refugee issue. And even now, when Tigrayans had to flee Tigray to go to Sudan, especially in Kassala, in the Kuba camp, which used to host Eritreans back in the 1980s. Same thing when Abiy Ahmed announced that Tigrayans had 72 hours to give up or to surrender. Tigrayans really were not sure whether or not that was actually something to heed those orders. Well, after the incursion started, since the Northern Command attack, you saw that as Tigrayan refugees as well going into Sudan, as that flow started to occur, the military intentionally blocked the passageway for Tigrayan refugees to find safety. Because at that point, I would say they started to make less distinction between the Tigrayans fighting for the cause that they believed in, the TDF, and the Tigrayan just civilians. And over time, this distinguishment to make between these two peoples it's slowly eroding. And now there's this blanket policy of just treating everyone the same in Tigray. And I guess this is something, and I don't have proof for this, but I guess this is something that I'll be learned from Isaias, and that all the Eritreans, no matter what reason they left, whether it was actually due to persecution, whether it was due to military service, whether it was due to being a political dissident, you treat them all the same as traitors. And over time, it has really poisoned the rhetoric in the Ethiopian body politic. I'm sure you know Daniel Kibret, the pastor, or I guess he's a deacon, who's a spiritual advisor to Prime Minister Abiy. He used very serious genocidal language against Tigrayans, saying people of this kind should not be born again. I'm paraphrasing. So that kind of thing, it doesn't just affect Eritreans, it also affects Tigrayans in this particular case. It's a devastating and a needless violence. And I say this as an Eritrean because we have to acknowledge, the war and its effects on the population have such a multifaceted effect. Uh, it's just a wide-ranging effect on people that we may never know fully the extent to which the crimes have affected everyone or all the peoples involved. Because some of the memories or the legacy of people resisting has sadly they've gone because they've died. Either they've been killed or they've starved to death. So, this is a very long answer and a long, elaborate explanation to your question, but thankfully, I have not had any personal uh, contacts or anyone in my family who has died. Hopefully that's the case moving forward. But even for people who have, what can I say? It's just a devastating loss and unnecessary, completely unnecessary. And even for Tigrayans who have died as well, I feel the same way. There's no reason why this should be happening at all. At the very least, they should make the distinction between who's fighting and who's just a civilian. But, as you can clearly see, the Ethiopian government does not care as long as their mission is completed. And how long have we heard this, by the way? The Ethiopian government keeps saying, we're going to win. We're going to defeat them. We're going to do this. There's no military solution to this conflict. After the Ethiopian military took over Mekelle in November of 2000, they said the war is over. They didn't even call it a war. They said the law enforcement operation is over. They said everything is fine. It's a restoration process now. Well, now it's January of 2022 at the time of this recording. They're still fighting. And no longer do they say it's a law enforcement operation. Now they say it's a war against the West. Now they say, oh, this is Africa. The TPLF is a functionary of the CIA. It's all of this red herring nonsense. And it also discredits people as well. Anyone who tries to stand up to the Ethiopian government's repressive policies, people face backlash. And something I'd like to learn more about from your perspective is, how do people respond to that backlash when people tell you that you have no opinion which can be viewed as legitimate because of your ethnicity or because of your political leaning? What does that do to your people? How does that make you feel? Does that dampen the spirit of people who are going through such a horrendous set of circumstances?
I often spend a little too much time on Twitter, going back and forth with people, and I might bring up a point that the government is intentionally blockading Tigray, for example, and I'm told that that's TPLF propaganda, and I am a TPLFite, ITE afterwards, TPLFian. I'm paid by TPLF. I mean, this is what we hear, and especially there's a really vitriolic rhetoric against Tigrayans in the diaspora as well, because it is in their belief that Tigrayans who live in the diaspora somehow financially benefit from TPLF's previous involvement in the federal government for 27 years. I've been told, me and my relatives and friends have been told that all of our college tuition is paid off because we're Tigrayan or we're TPLF affiliated. We've been told that we live extravagant lives in the West, and I'm sure you've also heard that a lot of these so-called Eritrean refugees are not actually Eritrean, but they're Tigrayan pretending to be Eritrean, and this goes back to this sort of privilege loop that they've tried to throw us into, that we're sort of manipulating the world, manipulating the media, manipulating the international community, and using our privilege as Tigrayans to sort of get our way through life, And it's a very contradictory message as well. I mean, a lot of the arguments that people try to make against the TPLF is that they didn't do anything for the people of Tigray and left them poor and underdeveloped. And then on the same light, they'll say that they disproportionately invested in Tigray and made the region a lot wealthier and gave it a lot more privilege as opposed to the other places in Ethiopia. So you really don't know what you're going to get on a given day. And that being said, there's obvious glaring criticisms that we can make of the TPLF, but I mean, these tropes just being thrown at Tigrayans has not helped. And what also doesn't help is the federal government engaging in this sort of hate speech. I mean, what else can you call it? I mean, after federal troops were forced to withdraw from parts of Tigray towards the end of June of last year in 2021, Abiy Ahmed said openly that Tigrayan villagers lied about how much food aid they needed. Tigrayans gave Ethiopian soldiers poisoned water, led soldiers into ambushes. I mean, if you allow me to share the screen, I mean, let's just look at this, or if let's just look at this comment from the Federal Communications Bureau of the government itself. I'll read it out loud, if but it is to be recalled that the constitutionally legitimate power of the federal government to freely redeploy our defense forces and military logistics outside of Tigray region following the national security assessment it conducted in different parts of the country. This, however, was met with a plea from the people of Tigray, who unduly demanded the presence of the military within the Tigray region. Nonetheless, the same people who demanded the government to accept their request failed to denounce TPLF and made no attempts to stop targeted attacks on our defense sources by the terrorist TPLF forces, let alone protecting them. Following the first operation that aimed at putting back the place of rule of law order through reclaiming looted properties, bringing perpetrators to court, ensuring justice, reversing the status quo, the people of Tigray have exhibited some level of cooperation, which at the latter stages of the operation have turned into opening massive target attacks on our defense forces from behind. This act of betrayal was a repeat of TPLF's attack on the Northern Command. This is what they're saying openly, calling an entire ethnic group, an entire region of people, backstabbers, sellouts, and folks who've betrayed their country. So this is something from the top down. This is not just a few bots on Twitter. This is something that has been institutionalized now.
Do
As
you
you mentioned,
think do you
yeah, go ahead.
think that just a quick question, do you think that those Twitter bots, how did that even occur? Because it's been a concerted campaign to propagate certain narratives about the war. You probably have some experience in computer science or technology. How does that even play into a role where the government is trying to shape the narrative of what's happening in Tigray?
I believe there was a Harvard study that linked misinformation about the conflict and created sort of a web that included several notable accounts in which these sources of misinformation were spread. It's also a coincidence when you see, for example, a bunch of accounts that were opened uh, November 2020 or January 2021 with no actual human face, sometimes an AI generated face, and sometimes sort of just a picture of a flag or just a random picture. Um, which is why I put my face on Twitter. I am very unequivocal about that. I am a real person. But that being said, there is a concerted effort. I mean, and also to be fair on the Tigrayan side as well, uh, there's been an uptick in analysts, especially non-Ethiopian or Eritrean analysts, sort of making a career off of this conflict, whether it be, BT Newsroom, the Rania Kalix of the world, their counterparts who've actually been able to travel to Ethiopia. Um, there are also accounts like Rashid Abdi, and unfortunately the incentives on Twitter have basically given these accounts a lifeline to spread misinformation and to spread information that they know that their audience wants in return for likes, for streams, and for overall career enhancement and um, uh, career improvements. So that's been an unfortunate trend that we've been seeing online. But I guess you've been on Twitter longer than I have, possibly. You do have more followers, and you've been able to actually have actual analysts come on your shows and do interviews. How has sort of social media and the internet world, how have you been able to navigate that? And what are some of the things that you've been doing to be effective, I guess, in establishing presence?
Well, I take a very methodological, mess up the word, methodical approach to social media because, um, as you rightly said, the social media aspect of the conflict is really felt with certain personalities who have been able to profit, maybe not monetarily speaking, but in terms of notoriety, um, been able to improve their status within the internet atmosphere. And I would say in this respect, I do a lot of research when it comes to the presenters, the interviewees, the information that I post on my website as well. And it started really as an aberration, I would say, because when the conflict began in Tigray, I really had a moment of clarity where I said to myself, you know, up to this point, I don't think there's been any platform that has um, covered issues in the Horn of Africa uh, sufficiently and to my liking. And so I thought I would, I might as well do that, and I might fill that role. That hasn't been easy because I'm a student, and politics, economics, history, these are not subjects that I study in school. I was not trained to do any of these sort of issues. But nevertheless, I am Eritrean, and I do have some understanding of what's happening. I wouldn't say I've never been oblivious to what happened, but I would say that the war that we're seeing now, I guess, not just for me, but for people of our generation, this has been the entry point for our generation to get involved in politics in the Horn of Africa. In my parents' generation, it was through the struggle against the Derg regime. And I would say maybe in the years between my birth and my parents' uh, adolescence was the border war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So we're really seeing a kind of generational wave of people getting involved through different aspects of communication. Our generation is in a unique position because the internet is such a vast open source network of information, disinformation as well, that it really makes it hard to discern what is true and what is not true. And so for me, when I started my platform, when I started to speak out on Twitter, which up until then I hadn't had any account, I did so primarily for the reason of talking about the issues in Eritrea and also in the Horn of Africa more generally. And I would say that since that time, I've grown in appreciation to learn from the perspectives of people like yourself, because I do want to know what people from Tigray think about the war. Also, as I said, I'm willing to speak with just about anyone about what's happened. And I would also say maybe in this respect, Asmerom, because um, you might have seen the recent social media bans from pro-regime supporters. Simon Tesfamariam is a name that comes to mind. And I've been asked once, why don't you invite people from the other side to talk with you? Why don't you give them a voice and let them explain themselves? Well, fundamentally speaking, this really goes down to the question of free speech on social media platforms, I would say. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the United States congresswoman, she was banned after spreading COVID-19 misinformation Donald Trump, the same thing. What we really have to get down to is the freedom of speech should not manipulate or, uh, uh, I guess, spoil the truth and the way in which we are understanding a situation. And in the case of Eritrea in particular, uh, the media has no freedom and there's no ability for people to speak freely about what's happening with candidness and honesty. And so by inviting people like Simon Tesfamariam or other Eritrean pro-regime supporters, I feel like it would be a disservice to people who trust my interviews and who trust my news analysis to invite people that would not invite me if I was on their platform, if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, if I wanted to go to Airy TV and ask to be on their platform to have a conversation, would they allow me to be on? That's a rhetorical question. But the point is, there's a clear distinction that I make between people who I could have a conversation with, who probably have different views than myself, but still have an intelligent um, discussion over issues, and people who fundamentally do not agree or believe in the idea of freedom of expression. And that's really hard to discern for some people because they may be absolutist in their understanding of what it means to have your voice to be heard. There's also people who just want to, as you said, be more notable, and just as long as they can get views, it doesn't really matter what they say or who they bring on. You mentioned Rania Kalik, also Eugene Puryear. Those individuals, I think, have unfortunately taken advantage of a very complex situation and have used it to garner a new base of support. The only thing I'll really say in terms of their actual analysis about what they think the Ethiopian government is doing right or wrong is that they really don't have much understanding. They really don't have a good context as to the political nature of the war. And that's something that has been contested even within Ethiopian and Eritrean circles as well for at least a year now, if not more. People say, well, the Northern Command was when this war began. That's the start. No, well, the Tigray regional government holding the elections, that was when the war began. Well, Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias, when they signed the agreement, that's when the war. So there's a lot of conflicting ideas, but the point is that they exist. If you're not allowed to express that freely and have a debate in good faith, then do you really owe people your time to speak with them about those issues? And I think in the case of Eritrea, we have to make the distinction between people who are genuinely and honestly trying to understand the other side of the aisle and people who are just trying to be opportunists. Because that really is the fundamental question. Are people really invested in this as a humanitarian, as someone who really wants to feel compassion about it? And you probably know this as yourself, as someone who has had to deal with a lot of hate speech against Tigrayans for a long time now, but even it's been ramped up because of this war. So I would say, in response to this, it's really hard. I mean, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a technician or anything related with computers. So I hope Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, the social media giants take concerted measures to really limit hate speech and also to verify information and to make that the standard by which they analyze certain controversial statements. COVID-19 has affected the world in so many ways, but in particular, the information aspect of digital consumption. How do we consume our media? Before the pandemic, there were no notifications or no signals about whether something was disinformation or not. And now we see that on YouTube videos or on Wikipedia links, they actually have, this is misinformation, or this is not true, or this is approved by the CDC. And whatever you think about these institutions, they make the effort to establish a narrative which is based off of facts that have been founded by reputable institutions of the government. Where does that go in Ethiopia? Where are the independent institutions that can do fact checking? The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which is a state-owned entity, has been criticized by all sides of being biased. I mean, and you could talk about this when the report came out with the United Nations. How did you feel when that came out? Because a lot of Tigrayans were dissatisfied that that report was not adequate enough in revealing the crimes that were committed. The Ethiopian government said that they didn't actually do all the crimes that were listed. I mean, how would you respond to that report, but also to the challenge of trying to get the truth out?
So there's plenty of things the report did say and did not say. First of all, there was 13 instances in which the report stressed the need for further investigation. But I guess everyone read the report or claims to have read the report and come out with their own conclusions. And the report was sort of a way for many of the pro-regime activists to claim that genocide did not actually occur, which is not what the report says. The mandate of the report was simply to tally the war crimes that occurred in the region from November to June. There's a lot that they left out. There's a lot that they did capture, which I thought was important. I'm not one of those people to wholly dismiss the report as it is written, but I think if people actually read it, they'll find that it doesn't actually say what they claim that it says. It stressed, again, like I said, it stressed the need for further investigation, 13 different occasions. And that is why the United Nations Human Rights Council has actually opened up another possibility for another report to be done, this time without the nationally funded human rights organization, which, to the ire of the regime and its supporters, but I think it was a necessary step. And I don't think it goes into contradiction to what the report has said and advocated for.
That's such an important aspect, that the United Nations has approved a new report to be commissioned in order to find out the atrocities committed by all sides, including the Tigrayan forces, who, from the perspective of Ethiopians, have not been scrutinized enough in the international media. And to an extent, I can understand that certainly the coverage has shifted in favor of expressing an Ethiopian government which is not allowing any peace talks to occur, or not allowing any negotiations to occur. But I would say, in the same sense, that the Ethiopian government is the federal structure that holds the entire country together. They have a responsibility, ultimately, to manage the crises that occur. Those people appointed in the House of Federation, in the Prime Minister's office, they have the responsibility, which they swore to uphold the Constitution and also to manage the affairs of Ethiopia. And, putting all the blame on one side, I think, is kind of unhelpful. It's just really, people miss the point when we talk about the atrocities that occurred, and also when the reports come out. Sometimes, well, actually, in all instances, when one side is implicated with a crime, the other side is supportive of the institution that reports it. But then when the opposite happens, then the same thing occurs, which is interesting. A quick example, when the Maikadra massacre happened, Amnesty International was the first NGO, or I guess the first watchdog, that reported on that event happening, the massacre, which killed a lot of Amhara civilians. And Tigrayan media denounced it, and they said this was not true. And then later in November, when the Aksum massacre happened, which implicated the Eritrean military and also to a lesser extent the Ethiopian military, but mainly the Eritrean military, the Ethiopian government said, no, that's not true. And Amnesty International also reported on it. So it's a back and forth between, well, we support them when they say the right things. And it just is very, uh, as you said, it's like hypocritical. It's just very strange. Do you think that there's any chance for um, impartial investigators to actually go to Ethiopia and maybe Eritrea if needed to probe the sites in which these crimes took place? And do you think that there's actually a chance for this to occur? What prospect do you give to that actually happening?
The prospect of that actually happening, I think, is highly unlikely. Um, and if by the off chance that it does happen, and the chance is granted, I think so much time has passed from those incidents occurring. I think it'll be even hard for a fair assessment to be made about what has occurred. So much time has passed, so much of the evidence that would be necessary may cease to exist, particularly with maybe grave sites, maybe civilians reburying the people who were lost in these massacres in a more appropriate place. So I think with more time, it's a lot easier for these incidents to be sort of swept under the rug. And we also mentioned, especially in our last talk, the unwillingness of the regimes to grant access to these organizations without their supervision, especially. Um, as you know, the African Union did try back in June to come up with a fact-finding mission about the human rights allegations that were happening in the region, and they were told to cease and desist. This current proclamation made by the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, was met with contempt by the regime. They said that they would not cooperate, and they'll likely have to do much of their investigation remotely, which has its limitations. So I think we're far in between. I think we're very far from that actually happening. As you know, the 2016 Human Rights Report on Eritrea was done mostly remotely because the regime did not allow the UN to come in to investigate the country. And I sort of wanted to ask you, what was the impact of that report, and where do you see parallels between the way the regime in Eritrea handled it in 2016 and the way that the human rights situation is being handled now under the context of this war?
Well, if you've seen the documentary Escaping Eritrea, which was released in May 2021 by Frontline, in association with PBS, um, the outcome of the report was disappointing in the sense that there were reasonable grounds to suspect and also to implicate the Eritrean government in crimes against humanity, in torture, imprisonment of an arbitrary amount of time, enslavement. These are not just speculations. These are not just something I'm just saying, it's hearsay or anything. No, this is recorded as fact by the UN Commission of Inquiry via interviews that they've done throughout the world, people who came forward with testimony. And it's consistent with the findings of other reports that have happened over time. and with other Eritreans who spoke up even before the report was released about it. The reason why I say it's disappointing is because nothing was done after that. You know, the Eritrean government, unsurprisingly, denounced it. They said the UN was biased. They said the UN's report was the latest proof that they never respected Eritrean sovereignty because um, there's an, there's nobody so in Eritrea or in the world that respects Eritrea's independence because the United Nations federated Ethiopia with Eritrea and all of this, crazy reasons. Even though the findings of the report were 100% accurate and established a set uh, of bullet points, or I guess you could say takeaway messages that policymakers use to understand the situation when it came to the refugee crisis. Because in 2015, the first report actually came out in 2015, and the second report came out in 2016. That was during the height of the global refugee crisis, and governments around the world were using the reports of the UN and also from other reputable institutions to understand the reasons which Eritreans were fleeing from the country, even though at the time there was no war. So I would say the lack of any response from the United Nations, from the US, from the European Union to actually enact diplomatic measures against Eritrea, the government, not the people, that really had it demoralized people, it demoralized the citizens of Eritrea outside the country who were hoping that something would take place because up until that point nothing of substance had really been done to document the crimes of the Eritrean regime. And I would also say that even now that we're seeing today, you asked me about the comparison between 2016 and 2020, or the comparison between then and now, is that the Eritrean government is they have a cavalier attitude towards the human rights convention, the Geneva Convention. They have a very arrogant view of liberal democracies, and they they think that everyone who doesn't think like them is conspiring against them in order to um, undermine their sovereignty. I would just say that in this sense, it's really a self-serving narrative that the Eritrean government uses in order to justify what they're doing because there's no accountability in Eritrea. There's no courts, there's no police, there's no law enforcement that actually takes into account all of the issues that Eritreans want to bring up. So it's the similarities between then and now is that there's really nothing that has happened. There's no way for people to face justice. And that I think has been probably one of the most devastating impacts of the experience of Eritrea in the 21st century, not just when reports come out, but the fact that there are people in the regime who know what they're doing, yet they keep silent or they justify it in some way, I think is treasonous. Asmerom, I also wanted to cover something else, which is of significance, which happened within the past couple of weeks, has been the slow release of political prisoners in Ethiopia. In Eritrea, political prisoners, there are a lot of them, and they have not been released for years, in some instances, decades. But Ethiopia, as a country that has much higher significance for the world in terms of diplomatic activity, needs to show that it's willing to allow its own dissidents to be released. So we saw the release of people like Jawar Mohammed, Bekele Gerba, um, Iskender Nega, these high-profile political prisoners who were released, they represent the wide variety of views of Ethiopians, from Oromia to Amhara, all across the range of the Ethiopian nation. How would you react to that? I know a lot of Ethiopians were skeptical about this release, and maybe we're starting to see the tensions between the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments, and especially the Amhara government and the Ethiopian federal government, as to the release of people like Sephat Nega, I believe. Um, what do you have to say for the release of the TPLF political prisoners who were incarcerated? What do you have to say about the Oromo political prisoners? Are there differences in their experiences, and how do you see the long-term impact of that occur?
So I don't think that I think the releases of especially Jawar, Iskender, Bakala, I mean, these are people who have very large constituencies. And had they been allowed to participate in the most recent elections, I think could have given the Prosperity Party a real run for its money, especially in the capital where, Iskender has his base, especially in many parts of Oromia where Jawar has his base. So they're definitely not insignificant. I think it's something that should be praised. Quite frankly, they shouldn't have been in jail in the first place. That's number one. Um, uh, as opposed to the tensions we've been seeing, obviously, you have a lot of people in the country that are very unhappy that Sebhat Nega was released. I mean, was an 88-year-old man who was retired for years before before the conflict. That his son was murdered. I mean, I don't know what strategic advantage the government had to arrest him other than to humiliate, I think, the TPLF. But there's been talks that he might be involved in some negotiations, but I think that's where we've seen a lot of the tension. I mean, you have the godfather of the TPLF being let out of prison. I think that's angered a lot of Ethiopians, especially those who are part of the quote unquote no more movement. They feel like they've been taken for a ride. So we'll see how this plays out. I think Jawar has been awfully quiet, which is unlike him. He's very boisterous and very outspoken. And I think he's using this time to sort of gather a little bit of more information to see how he can make himself useful. When the war broke out, he actually wrote, I don't know if you've seen it, he actually wrote an article about how the transition to democracy has failed and how it led to the current outbreak. And he sort of laid a roadmap on how things can be mended. So hopefully he'll get back to that. Unfortunately, Eskinder Nigga has used his platform to preach more war. I think he recently said, that the army should continue to travel deep into Tigray. Uh, I think he's laid. I think he's quite pissed off with the decision to the release of these prisoners. So we'll have to see where this leads to. But I'm not gonna complain. I think this was a good decision. Hopefully, this will be the first of many good decisions to follow.
Well, what are the implications of this having on the tensions between the Amhara regional government and the Ethiopian federal government? Because they've already had tensions in the past over um, disputed territories in the western part of Tigray. What do you see with the release of these former TPLF leaders is the actual outcome of the Amhara regional government and the Ethiopian federal government? Could that actually be a source of a split of relations between the two? And is that linked in any way to the objectives militarily that each have? The Ethiopian government said that they would not withdraw, or they would not make any further advances into Tigray, and they would withdraw as soon as the Tigray regional forces withdrew as well. But the Amhara forces are pretty bellicose in their rhetoric. They're very much wanting to fight. Uh, where do you see that tension heading? And does any of this have to do with the overall national the attempt at national dialogue? How would you relay all these instances?
I think what they're worried about is that the release of these prisoners might be the set a precedent for eventual negotiations to happen with the TPLF. And a lot of those negotiations will likely be about the fate of Western Tigray, the territories of Tsalemti, Wolkait, and Umera. So I think they're worried that the federal support that they've had in the past to annex these territories will begin to dwindle, and that these territories might actually go back under TPF leadership, which is something that they did not want. The reason, the rationale that they had from entering this conflict in the first should belong into their regional state. Um, but then again, you have the Eritrean factor, which it seems like they're more willing to ally themselves with, I guess, Isaias and his crew, as they saw the partnership more beneficial and more, I guess, robust from the way they're looking at it. So if the release of the prisoners are the first step to actually ending this conflict peacefully, they feel that they might be left out in a further settlement that might compromise their ability to annex the land that that they've that they've taken. So I guess that's what they're worried about.
And just to clarify, when I say western part of Tigray, I don't personally mean that, or I don't personally feel that that area of land is inherently part of Tigray or Amhara area. That's the only reason I even say that is because at the beginning of the war, that piece of land was part of Tigray. When you look back at the maps, that was it. Whether that's true or not, or whether that was due to historical um, manipulations of populations and movement, that needs to be decided by Ethiopians. So I don't have any personal stake in that, but I just wanted to clarify because I know a lot of people uh, are very sensitive to that topic over time as the war has progressed. Finally, I'd like to ask Asmerom, in order for the parties to the conflict to understand the significance of the fighting that they have uh, incurred onto the people, we earlier spoke about the human cost of the conflict. What do you think needs to happen in order for the Ethiopian federal government to recognize the significant amount of human lives lost? Is that even something that can be communicated to the highest levels of government, considering that a lot of Amhara regional government forces and people, volunteers who have signed up to fight, have lost their lives? Tigrayans who are trying to sign up for the Tigray Defense Forces, they are losing their lives as well. Where does all this, the human cost of war lie? Who's responsible, and um, how can this be acknowledged? Of course, in the midst of fighting, I think we're all focused on trying to get to the peaceful outcome and trying to see if there's going to be a victor, if you can use that word. But afterwards, how can we understand the human cost of this conflict? It's just been an absolutely horrendous uh, event that has occurred for no reason other than to stir up controversy. How would you contemplate on that?
I think, unfortunately, I mean, the Ethiopian government has so much human and resources behind it that the losses that they've incurred may not be easily felt on a population of over 100 million people, right? Just sort of the way that we saw in the war against the border war during the 1998 and 2000, where Ethiopian forces took very heavy losses, but they were able to use their manpower and uh, and sort of advantage they had numerically against Eritrea to sort of brush it aside. Whereas Eritrea, I think, lost upwards of 3 or 4% of its population during that conflict. It was just horrendously bloody on both sides, but they were able to withstand a lot of the casualties. The Eritreans not so much. I think the TPLF has a lot of questions it needs to answer as well. I don't know if you saw, but the few opposition parties in Tigray have actually called out the TPLF today in a letter saying that there should be a transitional arrangement. And quite rightly, in my opinion, pointing out the horrendous decisions that they've made over the past 30, 40 years that have brought us into this moment. You know, TPLF will eventually have to explain how, after 27 years of being in the federal government, that within a few years they're surrounded by enemies and being invaded on all different sides. You know, whose idea was it to illegally occupy Badame for 20 years? Whose idea was it to create the OPDO? Whose idea was it to remain in the federation? It was this is the TPLF's doing, and I think their hubris over the past 30 and 40 years have really come back to bite them in the behind, unfortunately. So I think everyone has to really reflect and do some soul searching to prevent this from happening again.
Well, we could speak for a lot of time about many other issues. And again, having these conversations where we just bounce ideas and questions off of one another, I think is very helpful because I learn a lot from the Tigrayan position about this, and I hope you feel the same about the Eritrean position. Having said all of this, Asmerom, I'd like to give you the final word.
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me on, George, again. I think this was the second conversation that we've had, but I think we've been able to expand on the topics. I mean, as more news rolls in, I think grants us more interviews and more discussions. I'd like to hear some final words from you, if you don't mind, uh, saying what you feel about this conversation and the direction that this might go in.
Sure. All I will say is that I think these are necessary steps in order to reconcile both of our people. And in order to really acknowledge the extent to which we've suffered, we first have to admit that there are things that maybe we didn't personally take part in or are guilty for, but we should explain in order for others to understand. And I think in the case of Eritrea, we have a duty as Eritreans to speak out. And as I said earlier, the moment of clarity for me happened during the onset of the war. You know, if you see something, say something. So I think in that sense, we have a responsibility, even if we're not professionals, if we're just laymen, that we can actually make a difference. Maybe not a big impact, but a small difference that will change the views of hardened hearts uh, and actually help ease the tension between the people of this region because we desperately need it. But Esmerom, I'd like to thank you for speaking with me.